In the spring of 1883, a Japanese woman stepped off a buckboard in Wyoming Territory, carrying a lacquered chest and a photograph of a man she had never met. His name was Tucker, and he had requested a wife from a matchmaker because 6 years of ranching alone had worn the words right out of him. But the woman, who arrived in a silk kimono with jet black hair, pinned in a traditional knot, was not what he expected. She whispered and offered to cook for him before he could find a single word to say, and the bowl she set in front of him that evening would freeze his hand in midair and make him question everything he thought he understood about the stranger standing in his kitchen. Before this story begins, stay until the very end to see how it unfolds, because the distance between a bowl of miso soup and a plate of frontier beans is the distance between two people who might save each other or lose everything. If it moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this tale travels across the world. The buckboard rolled to a stop in front of a ranch house that looked like it had been built by a man who didn't expect company. One room, low to the ground, the logs chinked with mud that had cracked and dried in the wind. A stovepipe jutted from the roof at an angle that suggested function had won every argument with appearance. The porch sagged on one side, and a pair of worn boots sat beside the door like sentries who'd given up. Himari stood in the yard and looked at the house. The way a person looks at a sentence, it can't quite translate. She'd imagined a home. This was a shelter. The difference between those two things sat in her chest, like a stone she'd swallowed and couldn't bring back. The driver set her chest on the ground, and it landed with a muffled click, objects packed in cloth, shifting against each other inside the lacquered wood. The ranch foreman, a wiry man with a sunburned neck named Pete, looked at the chest and then at her, and then at Tucker, who was standing in the doorway with his arms crossed and his face giving away nothing. She brought her own coffin, Pete said, and the two hands behind him laughed, the way men laugh when they aren't sure whether the joke is funny or just mean. Tucker didn't laugh. He looked at Himari the way he looked at a fence that needed mending, with the patient resignation of a man who'd been handed a problem he didn't choose and couldn't return. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with hands that looked shaped by work rather than born to it. His jaw sat in a permanent clench that turned every expression into the same expression which was no expression, and his eyes were the pale gray of sky before snow. Himari bowed low. The bow was deep and formal, kind her grandmother had drilled into her until it became as natural as breathing, her back straight, her hands folded at her waist, her forehead dipping toward the dust. She held it for 3 seconds, then straightened. Tucker didn't know what to do with a bow. He'd seen men shake hands, nod, clap each other on the shoulder, but no one had ever bent toward him like that, like he was someone worth respecting. He nodded a single jerk of the chin, and immediately wished he'd done something else, though he couldn't have said what. She picked up the chest. It was heavy, heavier than it looked, and she carried it with both arms wrapped around it, her silk sleeves pulling against the lacquered wood. Pete reached to help, but she shifted her weight and moved past him, crossing the yard with steps so precise they looked measured, and set the chest inside the door without asking where it should go. Tucker watched her carry that chest and thought about how her arms didn't shake. She was small, thin in a way that spoke of the long journey rather than frailty, and the chest had to weigh half what she did, but her steps never faltered, and her breath never quickened. He hadn't expected that. The house was one room with a stove in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, a bed against the far wall, and a shelf holding a lantern, a bag of coffee, a tin of flour, and a jar of salt. The Dutch oven sat by the door like a dog waiting to be told where to lie. Cast iron pans hung from nails on the wall, black with years of bacon grease. A sack of dried beans leaned against the shelf, and the floor was packed dirt, swept clean. Himari looked at the kitchen and understood something in the first 10 seconds that would have taken Tucker a year to explain. This wasn't a place where food was made with care. It was a place where food was made because a man had to eat. And the difference between those two things was the distance between her grandmother's kitchen in Kyoto and this room that smelled like smoke and animal fat, and the kind of loneliness that settles into wood and stays. That night, after Tucker had shown her where the well was and where the chickens roosted, after he'd eaten a plate of beans and bread in silence, and she'd eaten a smaller plate of the same, he lay on the bed and she sat on the floor beside the chest, with a kerosene lantern casting its amber flicker across the lacquered surface. He pretended to sleep, and she pretended not to notice. She opened the chest. Inside, packed in cloth that smelled like cedar, were sealed jars of dark miso paste, paper packets of dried kombu, katsuobushi, shaved so thin it was nearly transparent, a suribachi grinding bowl with its wooden pestle, a shamoji paddle for rice, and a set of saibashi, the long cooking chopsticks her mother had used. Beneath all of that, in a compartment so small you'd miss it if you didn't know it was there, sat a wooden case no larger than a man's hand. It held needles so fine they caught no light, packets of dried herbs, and a small mortar for grinding. Her grandmother's tools. 2 lifetimes of knowledge packed into a chest that a man in Wyoming had called a coffin. She was up before him. The sky outside the window was still black, and the air inside the house was cold enough that her breath hung in the amber light of the lantern she'd lit without making a sound. She'd studied the stove the night before, running her hands along its iron surface, learning where the heat concentrated and where it faded, mapping it the way she'd once mapped the charcoal brazier in her grandmother's kitchen. The stove was different from anything she'd used. It burned wood instead of charcoal, and the heat came in surges rather than the steady, even warmth she knew. She fed it split logs from the pile by the door and waited for the iron to settle into something she could work with, her hands moving through the kitchen with a quiet efficiency that came from years of being taught that a woman who can't control her fire can't control her kitchen. She found the water bucket and filled the pot. From her chest she took the kombu, the thick dried kelp that would form the base of her dashi, and dropped a strip into the water to soak. From a paper packet she measured katsuobushi, the dried bonito shavings that smelled like the ocean, like home, like something so far from this dirt-floored room that it made her throat tighten. The miso was in a jar sealed with wax. She broke the seal and scooped a portion into the suribachi, grinding it with a little soaking water until it smoothed into a paste that would dissolve without clumping. The smell rose in the warm air, fermented and salty and deep, and for a moment she was back in Kyoto, standing beside her grandmother at the brazier, learning the first thing a woman in her family learned to make. Tucker woke to that smell, which was not bacon and not coffee, but something that sat in his nostrils, like a question he couldn't frame. He lay still, with his eyes open, trying to place it, trying to decide if it was good or bad or simply foreign. He couldn't decide. He pulled on his boots and walked to the kitchen. Himari stood at the stove with saibashi in one hand, the long cooking chopsticks moving through the pot with a rhythm that looked rehearsed. Her travel coat was off, and her kimono was visible, a deep blue with white cranes that her mother had sewn for the journey. Her jet black hair was still pinned in the knot from the day before, not a strand out of place, and her profile in the lantern light was all sharp angles, high cheekbones, a narrow jaw, eyes so dark they looked black in the shadow of the stove's glow. She ladled the soup into the lacquer bowl with the lid and set it on the table in front of his chair. Then she poured coffee from the tin pot, Coffee she'd made by guessing at the proportions because she'd never made coffee before, and set that beside the bowl. Tucker drank the coffee first. It was terrible, thin and bitter, and boiled too long. The kind of coffee a person makes when they've never tasted it, but have watched someone else make it from across a room. He drank it all because it was the first cup anyone had handed him in 6 years, and the warmth of it in his belly had nothing to do with the taste. He didn't lift the lid on the bowl. Pete arrived with eggs from the henhouse, and the morning light was coming through the window now, catching the steam that rose from the pot. He stopped in the doorway and stared at Himari in her crane-patterned kimono, holding a wooden paddle he'd never seen, surrounded by smells he couldn't name. "The China woman cooking already?" Pete said, with the flat amusement of a man who finds the world simpler. When he can put things in boxes he already knows. Tucker set down the coffee cup. The sound it made was not loud, but it was final. The sound of a man placing a stone at the end of a path. Japanese. One word. The first word he'd spoken to another person about her, and it was a correction. Pete looked at him, looked at her, and shrugged the way men shrug when they decide a fight isn't worth the effort. He set the eggs on the counter and left. Himari hadn't moved during the exchange, but something in her posture shifted after Pete walked out, a settling, like a foundation finding ground it could hold. She didn't understand the word Tucker had said, but she understood the tone. She understood that he'd drawn a line, and she was on the inside of it. She lifted the lid on the soup bowl herself, poured the contents back into the pot, and began cracking eggs into the cast iron skillet. The miso soup would wait. She had time, and she'd learned something overnight that her grandmother had tried to teach her years ago. You don't serve a man food. He isn't ready to eat. You wait, you watch, and you find the door he left open. 3 days passed, and Himari mapped the kitchen the way a general maps a battlefield. She learned the stove's hot spots and cool corners, the way the iron grate conducted heat unevenly, the temperature at which flour burned, and the temperature at which beans softened. She found soybeans growing wild near the creek, a discovery that made her hands tremble when she knelt in the mud and pulled the first pod from the vine, because soybeans meant tofu, and tofu meant miso soup could be what it was supposed to be. She soaked the beans for 2 days, ground them with the sriracha, and boiled the paste in a cloth bag pressed between 2 flat stones to separate the milk from the pulp. She added nigari, a coagulant she'd carried in a small bottle, and watched the milk curdle into soft white curds that looked like clouds floating in a gray sky. The tofu wasn't perfect. It was grainy and dense compared to what her grandmother had made, but it was tofu, and it existed on a Wyoming ranch, which was a fact so unlikely that she pressed her palm against the counter and stood very still for a long time. On the 4th morning she decided it was time. She was up before the stars had faded. The kombu went into the pot first, simmering in water she'd drawn from the well and let settle overnight. She added the katsuobushi after removing the kelp, watching the dried bonito shavings sink and darken the broth to a color like weak tea. She dissolved the miso and the sriracha, blending it with hot broth until it was smooth, then stirred it into the pot with the shamoji paddle, moving in a figure-8 pattern her grandmother had taught her to keep the paste from clumping. The kitchen filled with a smell that had never existed in this house. It was warm and briny, and carried a depth that sat in the back of the throat, the taste of the sea and the earth and the patience of fermentation, months of waiting compressed into a bowl of soup. She sliced green onions from her garden, thin as thread, and floated cubes of the tofu she'd made on the surface, and she ladled the soup into the lacquer bowl with the lid, and she carried it to the table, and she waited. Tucker came in from checking fences. The sun was barely up, and his boots were wet with dew, and he stopped in the doorway, the way a man stops when the air in a room has changed so completely that his body knows it before his mind does. The smell hit him first, and he stood there breathing it in, trying to find the word for it, failing, because there was no word in his vocabulary for what miso soup smells like to a man who's never left Wyoming. He sat down. Himari stood across the table, with her hands folded, her dark eyes watching him with a steadiness that didn't waver. She wasn't breathing. She hadn't realized she'd stopped. "Let me cook for you." The words came out in a whisper so quiet that the lantern flame almost swallowed them. They were English, the only English phrase she'd practiced, repeated to herself on the ship across the Pacific until the sounds felt natural in her mouth, and she said them now with the careful precision of a woman placing a stone on a wall she was building alone. She lifted the lid. Deem rose in a slow curl, carrying the smell upward into his face. The soup was pale gold, flecked with green onion, with cubes of white tofu, floating in a broth that was cloudy and alive. Nothing like the clear brown of the bean soup he ate every night. It looked like something a person had made, with intention, not with necessity. And the difference between those two things was written in every detail: the lacquer bowl, the lid, the way the steam curled, the way she stood. Tucker picked up the spoon. His hand was steady, the hand of a man who brands cattle and mends fences and has held a rifle in a snowstorm. He lowered the spoon toward the bowl. His hand stopped. The spoon hovered an inch above the surface of the broth, and Tucker's arm locked in place like a gate that had caught on its hinge. The soup rippled from his breathing, the pale gold surface trembling, the tofu cube shifting, and he stared at it the way a man stares at a locked door in a house he thought he knew, trying to remember where the key might be. Himari watched his hand. She watched the distance between the spoon and the surface of the soup, and she understood that distance better than he did because she'd crossed an ocean, and that inch of air was the same distance. The gap between what she knew and what he feared, and she couldn't close it for him. He dipped the spoon, brought it to his lips, and drank. His face changed. It wasn't disgust, and it wasn't pleasure, and it wasn't the blank mask he wore when the ranch hands brought him news he didn't want. It was confusion, deep and visible, the expression of a man whose tongue has just sent his brain a message in a language it can't translate. The soup was warm and salty and had a weight to it that he had no framework for, a flavor that didn't map onto anything in his experience. Not bacon, not beans, not coffee, not anything his mother had made when he was young enough to remember her cooking. He set the spoon down without saying it was good or bad, pushed back from the table, picked up his hat from the peg by the door, and walked outside without looking at her. The door closed behind him with the soft click of a latch that had been asked to do more work than it was built for. Himari stood alone in the kitchen. The soup cooled in the bowl, the steam thinning to nothing, the tofu sinking slowly beneath the still surface. She picked up the bowl, carried it to the window, and looked out at the ranch, spreading wide and empty under a sky so vast it made the chest in her room look like a toy. She could see Tucker walking toward the south pasture, his back to her, his stride long and deliberate, putting distance between himself and the bowl she'd placed in front of him with the kind of care a person uses when they're handing someone the most important thing they own. She poured the soup into the dirt beside the porch step. It soaked into the ground and disappeared, and she stood there with the empty bowl in her hands and thought about the photograph she'd carried from Japan, the one the matchmaker had sent of a man standing in front of a house with a flat expression and hands that looked capable. She'd studied that photograph on the ship and tried to imagine a life with the man in it, and the man she'd imagined wasn't the man who'd just walked out the door, without tasting more than a single spoonful of the food she'd spent 4 days preparing. That night, Tucker cooked his own beans. He stood at the stove with his back to her while she sat at the table and watched him work, and neither of them spoke. The beans hissed in the Dutch oven, and the coffee bubbled in the tin pot, and the silence between them wasn't the comfortable silence of two people sharing a room, but the loaded silence of two people who've discovered that the bridge between them has a gap in the middle, and neither one knows how to cross it. Days stacked on days. She tried frontier food, and the frontier food defeated her. Beans scorched on the bottom while staying hard in the center, because the stove's heat wasn't the kind that forgives inattention. Bread came out of the Dutch oven flat and dense, a brick of flour and water that even the chickens turned away from cornmeal mush lumped into a glue that stuck to the spoon and the pot and the roof of the mouth with equal determination. She was failing at his food the way he'd failed at hers, and the kitchen had become a place where neither of them won. One night she sat by the cold stove with a photograph in her hands, the lantern turned low, the amber light catching the edges of the man in the picture. He looked softer in the photograph, the line of his jaw less severe, his eyes holding something that might have been hope, or might have been the exhaustion of a man who'd placed an ad for a wife and was waiting to see if the world would answer. She wondered if she'd made a mistake that couldn't be corrected, whether the ocean she'd crossed was not just water, but a wall, and whether the woman in the kimono, standing in a dirt-floored kitchen in Wyoming, was the same woman who'd knelt beside her grandmother in Kyoto and learned that food was the first language of love. The frontier doesn't forgive mistakes. He folded the photograph and put it back in the chest and sat in the dark for a long time after the lantern went out. 2 weeks in, and the kitchen had become a negotiation, conducted entirely in gesture and silence. Himari had learned to make beans. Not good beans, but edible beans, slow cooked with salt pork in the Dutch oven, the way Pete's wife had shown her when she came to visit, with a bucket of milk and the first kind words Himari had heard from anyone outside the house. The beans were soft and salty and tasted like survival, and Tucker ate them without comment, which she'd learned was his version of acceptance, the absence of refusal being the closest thing to praise his silence could produce. She'd also started a garden. Behind the house, in a patch of dirt that got the morning sun, she dug rows with her hands and a stick, because the hoe Pete's wife brought was still too heavy for the ground she was working. She planted seeds she'd found at the general store, on her first trip to town, the trip Tucker had driven her on in the buckboard without speaking for the entire 8-mile ride. She'd planted daikon radish, green onions, and a type of leafy green that looked close enough to the shungiku. She knew from home that she was willing to risk it. The ranch hands rode past the garden and laughed, because a woman planting vegetables in Wyoming dirt was a woman who didn't understand what Wyoming dirt did to vegetables. But the seeds sprouted, and the sprouts grew, and Himari tended them every morning before the sun was high enough to burn. Tucker watched her from the porch. He hadn't spoken more than 10 words to her in 2 weeks, and those 10 words had been functional. Directions to the well, the chickens, the south fence. But he'd noticed things he couldn't have articulated if someone had asked him to, the way she woke before dawn and worked until dark, the way she carried water from the well without complaining about the wait, the way she knelt in the garden with her kimono pulled above her knees and her hands in the dirt and her face calm with the kind of concentration he'd only seen in men doing work they believed in. She didn't cry, didn't complain, and carried herself with a stillness that reminded him of something he couldn't name, a kind of dignity he'd seen once in a traveling preacher who'd stood in a Dust Creek saloon and refused to raise his voice no matter what the drunks threw at him. One evening she was sitting on the porch step watching the sky. The sunset had turned to the western horizon into bands of orange and purple that looked like the lacquer on her chest, layer on layer of color built up over time, and she was watching it the way a person watches something they're trying to memorize. Tucker came up the porch, looked at the sky, looked at her, and sat down on the step beside her, not close, with a foot of space between them. After a long time, when the orange had faded to gray and the first star had appeared, he said, "The beans are better." Himari didn't understand the words. She turned her head and looked at his profile against the darkening sky, the set of his jaw, the way his eyes were fixed on the horizon, and she read something in his face that the words themselves couldn't carry. It wasn't praise, wasn't warmth, but it was a crack thin as a needle in a wall she'd been pressing against for 2 weeks, and she understood it the way she understood the first green shoot in her garden, as evidence that something was alive under the surface even when the surface looked dead. She nodded, and he didn't look at her. They sat there until the stars were thick and the night air turned cold, and then they went inside, and the silence between them was different, not thinner, but lighter, like a room that had been opened to air after being shut too long. The next morning she came out to the kitchen and found a sack of rice on the table. Tucker was already gone out with the cattle before dawn, and the rice sat on the worn wood with no note because Tucker hadn't written one. He'd simply set the sack down and walked out, trusting that she'd know what it meant. She picked up the sack and held it in both hands and stood very still for a long time. He'd gone to town, asked for rice, and didn't know what kind to buy, so he'd bought the only kind the general store carried, a short-grained sushi rice that wasn't what she would have chosen, but was rice, and it was on his table, and he'd put it there for her. She pressed the sack against her chest and closed her eyes, and the kitchen was quiet, and the morning light came through the window and lay across the counter like a hand extended palm up. The rice was the first door that opened between them, but the door that would change everything wasn't in the kitchen, and it wouldn't be opened by choice. Jed got kicked by a horse on a Tuesday afternoon, and by Wednesday evening the wound on his forearm had turned from bad to worse. The hoof had caught him just below the elbow, tearing a gash deep, enough that the white of bone showed for a moment before the blood filled it in, and Pete had done what the frontier taught a man to do, poured whiskey on the wound, wrapped it tight with a strip of shirt, and told Jed to keep his arm above his heart. That was frontier medicine. Whiskey, pressure, and prayer, in that order, and the prayer was optional. By Thursday, the red streaks had started. They crawled up Jed's forearm like vines reaching toward the crease of his elbow, and the skin around the wound had gone hot and tight and swollen. The color of a sunset, and the smell was the smell of meat left in the sun. Jed's eyes had gone glassy, his skin clammy, and when Pete pressed the back of his hand to the ranch hand's forehead, he pulled it away like he'd touched a stove. Infection. Pete said the word the way someone says the name of something he's seen kill before, flat and certain, with the resignation of someone who knows what comes next. On the frontier, infection was a death sentence more reliable than a gun. The nearest doctor was in Laramie, 3 days' ride if the weather held, and the weather wasn't holding. Tucker carried Jed into the ranch house and laid him on the table, the same table where the miso soup had sat untouched. Jed was burning his breath shallow and fast, and his arm had swollen to twice its normal size. The skin stretched and shiny and streaked with red lines that reached past his elbow, now climbing toward his shoulder. Pete stood at the foot of the table with his hat in his hands and shook his head. "Nothing we can do but wait," Pete said, "and pray if you're the praying kind." Tucker wasn't the praying kind. He stood at the table and looked at Jed's arm, and then at the door, and then at the floor, his jaw working the way it worked when he was chewing on a decision he couldn't swallow, and the kitchen was quiet, except for Jed's breathing, which had started to come in short, wet gasps that didn't sound like a man who was going to see morning. Himari was standing in the doorway. She'd been there since they carried Jed in, her dark eyes tracking the wound, the red streaks, the swelling, the sheen of sweat on the ranch hand's face, and she wasn't seeing what the others were seeing. She was seeing a memory of her grandmother kneeling beside a farmer in Kyoto, who'd cut his leg on a plow blade and watched the same red lines crawl toward his groin. She was seeing her grandmother's hands, steady and precise, opening the wooden case, selecting the points along the meridian, grinding herbs into a paste that smelled like earth and medicine and the kind of knowledge that gets passed from one pair of hands to the next, because writing it down wouldn't be enough. She turned and walked to her chest. She opened it and lifted out the cooking supplies and set them aside, and beneath them, in the compartment that a man would miss if he didn't know it was there, was the wooden case. She opened it. Inside, in grooves lined with silk, were the acupuncture needles, so fine they caught no light, and packets of dried herbs, and a small mortar with its pestle, and a roll of clean cloth she'd boiled and dried in the sun. She carried the case to the table and set it beside Jed's arm. Pete stepped forward and put his hand on the lid. "This isn't your business, Chinawoman." The words weren't cruel. They were the words of a man who'd watched people die and made peace with the order of things, and the order of things said that a woman from a country he couldn't find on a map didn't get to decide who lived and who died on a Wyoming ranch. Tucker's hand caught Pete's arm. Not hard, not aggressive, but with the finality of a man closing a gate. Let her try. 2 words. The most he'd spoken to another person in a week, and they landed in the kitchen like stones dropped into still water. Pete looked at Tucker, and Tucker looked at Pete, and something passed between them that didn't need words, the understanding between men who've worked the same land long enough to know when one of them has made a decision that won't be unmade. Pete stepped back. Himari got to work. She boiled water and cleaned the wound, flushing it until the water ran clear. She ground herbs in the small mortar, dried plants that smelled like the mountains behind Kyoto, and packed the paste into the wound with fingers that didn't tremble. She selected needles from the case and placed them along Jed's arm in patterns the men couldn't follow, each one inserted with a precision that came from a decade of watching and being corrected. And her face in the lantern light wasn't the face of a shy woman whispering in a kitchen, but the face of someone standing in the center of what she was made to do. Nobody in the room spoke. The kerosene lantern flickered amber on the walls, and the shadows jumped, and Jed's breathing changed, not better, but different, and Tucker watched Himari's hands move and saw something he hadn't seen before. Not shyness, not foreignness, but the absolute focus of a person who'd found the one thing she knew how to do without doubt. He hadn't expected that or any of this. Jed was alive when the sun came up. The fever had broken before dawn, the sweat pouring off him like rain off a roof, and the red streaks had faded to pink, and the swelling had begun to recede. By the next day, Jed was sitting up and drinking water and looking at his arm like it belonged to someone else. And by the day after that, the wound was closing with a speed that made Pete, who'd seen 100 wounds go bad in his years on the frontier, take off his hat and scratch his head and walk away without a word. Pete never called her Chinawoman again. He called her ma'am, with a stiffness that was its own kind of apology, and the other hands followed, and the change happened without discussion, the way changes happen on a ranch, through the quiet agreement of men who've seen something they can't argue with. Tucker didn't know how to say what he'd seen. He was a man who'd spent his life communicating through work, through silence, through the things he did rather than the things he said, and the distance between what he felt and what he could express was a canyon he'd never learned to cross. But he'd watched Himari save a man's life, with tools he couldn't name, and he'd watched her pour her soul into a bowl of soup he couldn't bring himself to eat, and the distance between those two things was the distance he needed to close. He went to the garden. The daikon was ready, fat white roots pushing up through the dirt, and the green onions stood tall and bright against the brown of the ranch. He pulled 2 daikon and a handful of onions and carried them to the kitchen and set them on the table beside the rice she'd cooked that morning. Then he stood there with dirt on his hands and uncertainty on his face, a man who'd never asked for anything in his life, and said the only thing he could think of. "Show me." Himari looked at the vegetables on the table, then at Tucker, standing in the kitchen with uncertainty on his face, and she understood what he was asking, not just to learn to make soup, but to learn to meet her in the place where she lived, the place of food and intention, and the careful work of turning ingredients into meaning. She nodded once and pointed to the stool by the stove. He sat on the stool. She showed him how to simmer the dashi, how to lay the kombu in the water and pull it before the boil, how to add the katsubushi and let it steep and sink. She showed him how to dissolve the miso in the suribachi, blending it with hot broth, and he watched her wrists move in the figure-8 pattern and tried to copy it and couldn't, and she guided his hand with her fingers, light as a needle, until the motion found its rhythm. He sliced the green onions. His cuts were rough, the pieces uneven, nothing like the thin threads she produced, but she didn't correct him. She let him do it his way, and when he set the knife down, she took the pieces and floated them on the surface of the soup, and they sat there, imperfect, and green, and alive. Tucker added something of his own. From the pantry, he pulled a strip of salt pork, the kind he'd been eating since he was a boy, and he cut a piece and dropped it into the simmering broth. Himari watched it sink and paused, her head tilted, and then she nodded, because the salt pork would add a depth to the dashi that the katsuobushi alone couldn't carry, and it was a frontier trick she wouldn't have thought of, and the fact that he'd thought of it meant he wasn't just learning her food. They ladled the soup into 2 bowls, one lacquered, one tin. The broth was darker than her version, richer, with a smokiness from the pork that sat under the fermented salt of the miso, like a second voice joining a song. Tucker picked up his spoon and lowered it into the bowl, and this time his hand didn't freeze. He brought the spoon to his lips and drank, and the taste wasn't Japanese and wasn't Western, but something that had never existed before this morning in this kitchen on this ranch. He set the spoon down and looked at her across the table, and his face did something she hadn't seen it do, the muscles around his eyes loosening, the set of his jaw softening, the expression shifting from blank to something that wasn't a smile, but was in the same family. "Again tomorrow," 2 words was all he managed. And she nodded. Not love, not even trust, but a recognition, the kind that passes between 2 people who've both learned what it means to stand alone against forces stronger than themselves and have just discovered that standing together doesn't require understanding every word, only understanding the intention behind them. The kitchen smelled like neither Japan nor Wyoming. It smelled like something new, something that belonged to them and to no one else, and the steam rose from the bowls and curled toward the ceiling and disappeared into the warmth of a room that had been cold for a very long time. Weeks passed, and the kitchen changed. There were 2 bowls on the shelf now, one lacquered and one tin, sitting side by side like a sentence in a language that was still being written. The pantry held both rice and beans, the Dutch oven and the suribachi shared the same corner, and the shelf that had once held only coffee and flour now carried jars of miso paste beside a tin of salt and a sack of sugar. Himari wore her kimono to cook, the blue one with the white cranes, and over it she wore an apron that Tucker's mother had made 30 years ago and never used, a plain cotton apron with a faded flower pattern that had been folded in a trunk in the barn since the day his parents left the ranch. The combination shouldn't have worked, the silk and the cotton, the cranes and the faded flowers. But it did, because it wasn't a combination but a conversation, 2 pieces of cloth from 2 different worlds stitched together by the fact that a woman chose to wear them both at the same time. The ranch hands came to the house for dinner now. They sat at a table Tucker had built from split logs to replace the one that had sagged under Jed's weight, and they ate what Himari set in front of them, which was neither fully Japanese nor fully frontier, but something in between that nobody had a name for. Packed for the soup by pointing at the pot and grinning, the way a person points at something they've decided to trust. And she made it every time. With the salt pork, with the green onions from the garden, with the miso she'd learned to stretch by mixing the supply in her chest with soybeans from the creek. One evening, Tucker came in from the range and found the lacquered chest open on the floor, the medicine case beside it, and Himari grinding herbs at the table with the small mortar and pestle. The lantern cast its amber flicker across the needles in their silk grooves, and the herbs smelled like the mountains behind a city he'd never seen, and he pulled out a chair and sat across from her and watched her work. She looked up, and their eyes met across the table, across the herbs and the needles and the open chest, and the distance between them wasn't the distance it had been on the first night, when the chest sat between them like a wall. It was a different distance now, the kind that exists between two people who've learned each other's shape well enough to sit in silence without the silence being empty. He reached across the table and moved a packet of herbs closer to her hand. A small thing, the kind of gesture that would mean nothing to anyone watching, and everything to two people who'd spent months learning to speak in movements instead of words. She took the packet and her fingers brushed his, and neither of them pulled away, and the lantern flickered, and the wind moved through the house, and outside the Wyoming sky stretched wide and dark and full of stars that looked the same from Kyoto. The chest stayed open after that, 2 bowls on the shelf, 2 languages at the table, and a soup that tasted like neither home and both. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels.